Well, welcome to our FarmDoc Daily Live Coronavirus and Ag program. This one, global transportation and cash flow considerations. With our guest today, Gary Schnitkey from the University of Illinois and Ryan LeGrand from U.S. Grains Council. A couple of things to keep in mind. If you can go to the next slide, please. We'll do a quick poll on what you think about the lengthening of the stay-in-place guidelines to April the 30th that the president announced earlier in the week. So go ahead and vote on that very quickly if you can, and we'll get those numbers for you. During this half hour, make sure that you do write some questions down. There's a questions section over on the left-hand side of your screen, and you can put those questions in. We'll get those answered as soon as we can. About 60% of the folks have answered the poll at this point. And we're running, mostly 50% at this time, thinking that April 30th will be extended. So they think more than about a half of you are thinking that we're going to get that extended. So why don't you go ahead and put that up there. April 30th seems about appropriate, 40%. 30th is too far in the future, just 5%. And 47% say they think it'll be extended past the 30th of April. Gary Schnitkey is here. He's with the University of Illinois and will take us through some cash flows. Hey, thanks so much, Gary. I bet you had an interesting time putting this one together.
Yes, we did. And what we're doing here is looking at cash flows coming up for this coming year for grain farms. Here's a list of all the cash flows that can be impacted by the COVID-19 incidents or measures that have been put in place. We have old 2019 crop sales, new 2020 crop sales, and then future crop sales, as well as Ark County crop insurance and both Ark and PLC payments in 2019 and 2020. What we did here was focused here on the old 2019 crop sales. And again, we focused on those because those are the immediate ones to be impacted. So we did that. And actually, we did that in our FarmDoc Daily article that's appearing today. What we assumed here is before COVID-19, we were looking at $3.90 corn, $8.90 soybeans. And after COVID, if we're looking at prices right now, at least in central Illinois, and they may be lower in other places of the country, $3.30 per bushel for corn, $8.40 for soybeans. If we do that, and we assume that 30% of the crop has not been marketed at this point, which would be roughly 60 bushels per acre corn, 18 bushels per acre in soybeans, we would have $20 of less cash flow between now and August. And obviously, some farms may have other cash flows because of off-farm employment or employment and other farm enterprises, but we can expect to see $20 per acre less in cash flows because of those COVID responses and what has happened to prices as a result of those measures. Options to consider, most farms will have enough operating line of credit to cover that. We would think, and maybe some farmers are going to think about moving from corn to soybeans. Got that thing wrong there. Soybeans generally have less crop and maybe some reduced inputs. And again, see our FarmDoc Daily, March 31st, 2020. That old 2019 crop assumed that there was no payments associated with any disaster program coming up. We will have more detail on disaster programs in a Thursday webinar. Jonathan Koppas is leading in that effort along with Nick Paulson. And that will be covered on our webinar also on Friday. By the way, just so we know, those income levels are that $20 from now till the end of or beginning of next harvest is actually probably the least worrisome of the cash flows that we're looking at. We looked at projected 2020 farm income pre-COVID-19, and this would be for a 1,500 acre farm, 20% owned and the rest rented. 214 bushel per acre corn, 63 bushel per acre soybean yield. If we had $3.90 corn price, $9 soybean price, that farm would have $2,000 worth of net income in 2020. That was about $70,000 in 2019. So that would be a very low income level. That's assuming trend yields. If we got some trend yields, so that would be 225 bushel corn, 70 bushels soybeans, that would raise us to 76,000. Again, this is pre-COVID. Or if we could get another $60 per acre MFP-like payment, it would be $86,000 of net income. Post-COVID, we're looking at 330 corn price, 840 soybean price. We would see, and we're assuming that those would generate some significant 2020 ARC PLC payments, which would occur actually in 2021. That would actually, if we have trend line yields, it'd be minus $57,000 of income. If we get back to above trend line yields like we were pre-2019, 2018, 17, 16, we'd have $9,000 of net income. And then if we would get a $60 MFP-like payment, we would get up to $26,000. Those last two are separate from one another. So just to give you a feel for where we're at, the price declines that we think are happening because of COVID, or at least that the market is saying, would result in significantly lower incomes across grain farms across Illinois. And again, those numbers are just what the projections look like right now, and hopefully something good will happen in the near term. So that's it, Todd.
Mr. LeGrand is here from U.S. Grains Council. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I don't know whether you can confirm those numbers that I just read off or not. I think you probably maybe have had a look, maybe not. But why don't you give us a little bit about yourself and then proceed with your slides, please.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. Yeah, I'll have to take a look at the report that's just out. I've been on here with you guys so far this morning and haven't taken a look yet. I want to talk a little bit today about, just very briefly, for those of you who don't know who the U.S. Grains Council is and what we do. I want to talk about our current operational status at the council. Then I'll move on to what we're seeing and hearing from our global contacts. And then I'd like to finish up with some statistics on exports and the value that adds to the U.S. ag industry. So this is a map of where our offices are. And the U.S. Grains Council is a trade association focused on promoting exports of corn, barley, sorghum, dried distillers grains, and ethanol. We have 9 offices around the world, with the hopes of opening our 10th office located in Delhi, India, later this year. Our 106 employees and consultants here and abroad help us run programs in over 50 countries worldwide. Now, our priority has been and always will be the number one priority is the health and safety of council staff and consultants. We're making sure that we're attuned to the individual needs of every one of our coworkers and to the overall needs of the organization for the purposes of continuity of operations throughout this pandemic. All of our offices in the U.S. and around the world are currently in telework status, and we do not have a date set for everyone to return at this time. The council took action very early on in this process to protect our people when we put the Beijing office in telework status back in January. And then the Seoul and Tokyo offices transitioned to telework very shortly thereafter. And we've continued to transition our people to what are hopefully safer environments as this crisis has evolved. Now, some of our programs and meeting planning have temporarily been placed on hold, but our work certainly does continue. We're making contingency plans for industry meetings that we have scheduled. Our staff continues to engage customers overseas in foreign governments, and we are working to further our mission during these unprecedented times. So that was just a brief snapshot of where we are from an organizational standpoint. Now I'd like to talk about maybe some of the things that you're interested in, and that would be grain flows around the world. So going into grain flows around the world, it's very important to note that agriculture and ag infrastructure have been deemed as essential operations. So your work and ours will continue. We've been receiving questions and concerns from customers and from governments around the world about the continuity of operations of the U.S. grain export system. And we have spoken with port operators in New Orleans and in the PNW. We've spoken with container loaders throughout the country, and we've spoken with groups such as the Waterways Council. And the reports that we're hearing are that business continues largely as normal. Not hearing any slowdowns here on the U.S. side. We put out a letter to our customers around the world in attempts to ensure that our port operations will continue throughout the pandemic in response to these questions. And then just prior to this start of this webinar, many of you may have seen the video that is actually going public today. You guys were the first ones to see that, and we're going to be putting that on social media and other channels today. We just thought it's very important to continue to ensure to the world that we are open for business, and we will remain open for business here in the United States. Around the world, we're hearing reports from ports that they too are largely operational. Maybe some slowdowns in the receipt of vessels as they check crews and such. If there are any coronavirus infections there amongst the crew, they would take additional measures at those foreign ports. I'm hearing Chinese vessels into other countries are getting extra scrutiny right now. But again, around the world, everything is operating pretty much normally when it comes to the shipment and the receipt of grains. Our regular buyers have been in the market for corn. Japan, Korea, Mexico, and Colombia have been active recently. As a matter of fact, Japan was in the market just this morning for 113,000 metric tons. It's just short of 4.5 million bushels. Last week's corn shipments were an 11-month high, still off USDA's projected number for this crop year by about 130 million bushels. But seeing that uptick in corn shipments is a bright spot, amongst all of the bad news that we're seeing and hearing from around the world. A lot of you may have questions on China. As you know, we have a phase 1 agreement in place in China. With China, we're waiting on other phases of this agreement. Not sure how that will be affected due to the current pandemic. I'm sure it will be slowed down, but China made some serious commitments to the United States and to the world in this phase 1. And going forward, we expect them to make drastic changes on their acceptance and approval of new biotech traits. They have agreed to give an average of a 24-month turnaround on any approvals of new events, so that if that holds, that is going to be a sweeping change for one of the largest consumers in the world, and it will benefit us greatly, provided that China continues to comply with this phase 1 throughout the year. Now, there are purchases that a lot of us have heard about, and nobody has really seen the details, and those are intentionally kept away from public eyes. But we expect, and we have seen, an uptick in grain purchases by China. We expect them to be in the market for distillers' grains from the United States. And when the economics come back into play, we expect them to be in the market for U.S. ethanol. Now, some of their recent activity includes a very large purchase about 10 days ago of 756,000 metric tons of corn. And that's just short of 30 million bushels of corn that they bought in one single purchase. That's the largest purchase on record from what we have seen in the last 7 years by China. There have been some larger purchases by Mexico. They make a 1 million ton purchase about every year, in addition to the 15 million tons that they're buying throughout the year, but they typically do a 1 million ton purchase. So it's not the highest on record, but for China, it's the highest in the last 7 years, and that is promising. Last week and this week, we saw a total of 250,000 metric tons, or about 9.8 million bushels of corn sold to unknown destinations. We do suspect that is China taking advantage of the dip in the market. They typically classify those as unknown destinations, one, to hide the trade, and two, to make a decision depending on circumstances at the time of shipment, where exactly they want to ship it. So if it doesn't work to China at that time, they can ship it to another destination. Over 1 million metric tons of sorghum has been sold to China recently, and we expect that there's more behind that. China is working to register the United States ethanol plants. That's a work in progress, but it's something that has to happen to resume DDGS exports there. They have the potential to import over 5 million metric tons. So this is a market where we need to continue to operate. They currently have an anti-dumping and countervailing duty case on our distillers' grains, but the export of DDGS to China was a requirement in the purchases agreed upon in the Phase 1 deal. We don't know exactly how much, as far as volumes and prices were concerned. I highly doubt they discussed prices, but it was key in those negotiations, and we do expect to see exemptions to duties that have been levied on our distillers' grains as a result of that anti-dumping and countervailing duty case. So hopefully there's more good things to come with trade with China and other nations, but that's kind of what's happening. There are, as I mentioned, there are some bright spots amongst all the bad news that we're hearing. We want to go on to the next slide. So this is just a snapshot of how U.S. grains in all forms was exported in 2018 and 19. The council a few years ago started tracking the exports of what we call grains in all forms. And these tallies include the exports of the products we have promoted overseas for 6 decades, but they also include ethanol, which we've started promoting in the last 5 years, and they include poultry, pork, and beef. Now, these last 3 aren't products that the council works directly on, but by including export tallies for meat, we get a better picture of the amount of grains and feed that are leaving the country, not only in commodity form, but in the value-added form, and with that value created right here in the United States. The council's been on the forefront of ethanol promotion for several years now. I would consider ethanol as our top priority at present. Ethanol has been the United States' fastest growing ag export over the past 10 years. So we're focusing our efforts on exporting this value-added product, but we cannot forget the fact that on this slide, you see that 66% of the exports listed here are attributed to feed grains and distillers' dried grains. So we will continue to put an emphasis on the promotion of these products as well. Can we go on to slide 4? So this is an Informa study that was commissioned in 2018 to put a value on exports and the contribution of those exports to our ag economy. Results from the analysis show that the $19.1 billion in grain and grain products exported indirectly supported a total economic output of $55 billion in 2016. In other words, access to international export markets for U.S. grains supported an additional $38 billion in business, business sales, and that's during 2016. Moreover, the export of grain products supported by U.S. GDP by $19 billion over what would have occurred without such exports. And finally, it goes on to say that the number of jobs linked directly or indirectly to grain exports totaled nearly 274,000. So, this just goes to show you that the work that we do around the world, the council does, it does have value. It brings value directly back to the farmer's bottom line and to the ag economy in general in the United States. With that, I will turn it over to Todd and to Gary to see if there's any questions.
So I'm going to play our video now. So this is a video from the U.S. Grains Council, and it was just put together last night with pretty up-to-date information here. So we'll do that right now.
if you've got questions for Gary or for Ryan LeGrand, now's the time to go ahead and ask them. You can put them in the question section over there on the left-hand side of your page. I do have a couple of quick questions we'd like to address. Ryan, is there any positive news, by the way, to report when it comes to grain exports? We follow those pretty closely, and maybe you can follow up with some phase one and China discussion as well.
Certainly. So yes, there are certainly positive notes out there. As I mentioned, last week's corn inspections were an 11-month high. We have China and others in the market that continue to buy. And one piece of information that we're hearing from around the world is that there is certainty and there's confidence in the U.S. grain export system. And for that reason, buyers in North Africa, which are typically buyers of South American corn, are looking more and more to the United States as an origin because they have confidence that our supplies will continue to flow. They're worried about Argentina. About 10 days ago, Argentina briefly shut down their Rosario port, which is their main grain exporting hub. It was opened very quickly after that, but the fear is there that Argentina and other grain exporting ports around the world could shut down their operations, and that fear isn't quite as strong with the United States. We're seeing the same thing in Taiwan. Buyers are looking to book premiums in some instances just because they know that the grain that they buy from the United States is going to arrive on time at their port.
So we have a question here about ethanol prices and in particular China. So ethanol prices are reportedly low right now. Why is China not buying right now? What's the delay? Do you have any feel for that, Ryan?
Yeah, so ethanol prices are very low. They're about 90 cents a gallon FOB the Gulf, but we're seeing gasoline prices unfortunately much lower than that. If you look back historically, ethanol is consistently priced below that of gasoline, priced below aromatics, priced below MTBE, which is still an oxygenant that's used outside of the United States. But that relationship has reversed recently, and we're seeing cheap gasoline prices, and it's making it very difficult for ethanol to compete. Now, we did hear that the arbitration window was open last week in China for very briefly to make some ethanol sales. We do not know yet if any sales happened. We do know that our window already closed. It was open very briefly. So hopefully some folks took advantage of that and booked some U.S. ethanol. And if we find out about it, we'll be letting all of our stakeholders know.
Ryan, when gasoline and ethanol demand returns, what are the foreign markets that have the potential to import the most ethanol?
Sure. Canada and Brazil are our top two markets. So we would expect to continue to see strong shipments there. India is a big market for us on the industrial side, and we are working on the ground in India to try and get them to include fuel ethanol in their tenders when they buy ethanol from the international markets. But they're a third or fourth, depending on the year, largest importer of our ethanol, again, on an industrial basis. But if they were included in the fuel, that could really put India up close to the top or at the top of our export countries, of our export customers. Colombia continues to take more and more ethanol every year, and Peru also has increased their ethanol shipments from the United States. So there's some bright spots out there. We just need the gasoline demand to come back.
I do have a couple of other questions. So when you look to South America, how worried should U.S. farmers be about safrinha or second crop corn from Brazil in the June-July timeframe as competition?
Yeah, it's it's going to be a concern every year as Brazil continues to improve their efficiencies, and we have to do the same here in the United States. We need to continue to improve efficiencies such as the waterways and other infrastructure products that are sorely needed to continue to be the leader in terms of price and shipments around the world. But yeah, Brazil and Argentina have come on in a major way in recent years. We're currently looking at plenty of exportable supplies from them heading into the summer. We're facing headwinds on the currency side as well. As the world during this pandemic, the world has flocked to the world's two strongest currencies, that being the U.S. dollar and the Japanese yen. So we've seen considerable strength in both of those currencies, and it's come at the cost of currencies like the Brazilian real, like the Argentine peso. Even though Argentina has put restrictions in place on their exports in the form of taxes, that currency devaluation has really made those export taxes a wash recently. So yeah, we're concerned, and it's something we will continue to keep an eye on throughout the summer.
Gary, do we have a final poll that you can take?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
There you go.
We're going to do the final poll right now.
Yeah, so while you folks are filling out the final poll, one last question for you, Ryan. Should exports take a hit, would one mode of transportation likely be hit harder than the other? For example, rail versus barge? Or does it matter very much?
Hard to say. Rail. If you're thinking rail, that main customer there is Mexico. We rail a lot of corn, a lot of distillers grains and sorghum down to Mexico. So if that were to take a hit, we would see it in the way of vessels coming in from South America. But I don't see one particular sector being hit harder than the other. I guess it would just determine, it would be determined by which country first takes a hit. And then you would look to what mode of transportation do we use to ship to that country. It's really hard to tell right now.
So Gary, there are the numbers as they finished up this time around. So 22% still very concerned about grain exports because of COVID-19. 68% somewhat concerned, and 10% not concerned at all. Just 1% say they don't know. Ryan LeGrand, thank you so much. We appreciate you being with us for the day, and we hope you and your family are very well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ryan LeGrand, of course, is the president and CEO of the U.S. Grains Council. Joined us for this episode number 4 of our webinar series, and Gary Schnitkey has been here too. Thanks, Gary, for being along with us for the day. We appreciate that.